Today we're going to talk about suffering, which means we're going to have a big old ball of giggles. I'm going to tell you a story today that I've always been a little bit hesitant to tell, in part because for a long time I didn't feel like it was my story. The book of 1 Samuel, chapter 31, recounts King Saul's final battle with the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. After being badly wounded by archers, Saul decides that it is better to take his own life than to die at the hands of his enemies. When the Philistines find his body, they carry it to Beth Shean, and they hang it from the city walls as a symbol of what happens when you mess with the unstoppable force of their army. About 3 years ago, my wife Alyssa and I were standing at the entrance to this ancient city, which is today one of the largest national parks in Israel and one of the largest archaeological sites in the world. We were on day 3 of an 8-day tour of the Holy Land hosted by 2 local seminaries here in Kansas City. There were about 30 or 40 of us, mostly retired folks and a few students traveling by bus across the country and walking the path of the biblical story. Beth Shean is really an incredible park. Its name means House of Tranquility, which is kind of ironic considering that the city has been fought over for the better part of its almost 7,000-year history. It's built upon layers and layers and layers of ancient buildings, thousands of years in the making. You can walk down the main street, the Cardo Maximus, and you can see these massive pillars that were toppled by the Golan earthquake in 749 AD. And when you get to the middle of the city, there's a huge hill, almost a small mountain called a tell that rises sharply into an overlook of the surrounding area. We spent about an hour in the park and then returned to the entrance once it started to get hot. The high that day was about 95 degrees, and with virtually no shade in the park, it became a really dangerous place to hang out around in the midday sun. One by one, we gathered back at the shuttle that would take us to the bus, but soon it became clear that one of us hadn't arrived. Herman, an 80-year-old retired obstetrician from Platte City, about 40 miles from here, had come to Israel along with his wife Mary, and at some point he had strayed from the group. After about 15 minutes of searching for him, we were pretty sure that he wasn't in the restroom or getting a drink from the snack bar. And Herman had had some health issues a few years earlier, and according to Mary, was prone to become confused in extreme heat. Our tour guide and seminary chaperones immediately sprang into action. The local police and Israeli military were alerted. Within an hour, helicopters were flying overhead looking for any movement in the area, and I was part of 2 or 3 different shifts of search crews that went out to comb the park in the blistering sun. Police rode in on horseback, brought in search and rescue dogs, and there was even some talk of infrared, heat-seeking equipment that would be brought in at night. The atmosphere was intense and the stress levels high. We had no idea how an 80-year-old man could be so difficult to find. By late afternoon, our chaperones decided that the group needed to move on. One of the chaperones would go with us to our next destination, while the other would remain behind with Mary and assist the authorities in the ongoing search for Herm. The next 4 days were tough. Each day we prayed together that Herm would be found safe and that he would return to the group for the remainder of the tour. And with each passing day, I felt more and more uneasy about the chances of that becoming a reality. Herman went missing on a Friday. The following Tuesday, we were in the heart of Old City, Jerusalem, about to enter into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where tradition holds that Jesus was buried and resurrected 3 days later. While we were resting in the plaza, some police came up to our chaperones and took them aside along with Mary, and after speaking for a little while, they returned to our group. "The police have just let us know that they have found Herman," one of them said gently, "and he is dead." The details are still kind of sketchy. Herman was found about 3.5 miles from the park in an industrial area. Apparently he had wandered into some kind of storage unit and gotten locked inside when the workers went home for the weekend. Unfortunately, Sabbath began that evening, and then immediately following was the holy day of Shavuot, so it was a total of 4 days before he was found. Herman died alone in extreme heat with little air to breathe. And there we were, standing outside the house of resurrection with his grieving widow. The group formed a circle around Mary, and one by one, there in the streets of Jerusalem, we lined up to give her a big hug and tried our best to speak words of comfort to her. At least now I know what happened to him, Mary kept saying over and over, but I didn't get the feeling that it made her feel any better. The whole story made me sick to my stomach. I imagined the elderly couple packing their suitcases the week before the trip, not knowing that only one of them was going to come back. And I thought of how I would feel if it had been my spouse who had gone missing suddenly without me having the chance to say goodbye or tell her I loved her. The day they discovered Herm just so happened to be the day of our second wedding anniversary. The problem of suffering, also called theodicy, has troubled my faith for a long time. How can a good God exist alongside such unspeakable fear and suffering and death? It is one of the oldest and best cases against God's existence. Comedian Louis C.K. has remarked on how suffering is the inevitable end of all relationships. Either you fall out of love and end up experiencing the pain of divorce, or you live together long enough that someone eventually dies and one of you has to live on without the other. This seems to apply to just about everything. If we think about it long enough, all life ends in suffering. It's not just part of the human condition, it's part of the creaturely condition. And this is why it's so troubling to me. The existence of the entire cosmos appears to be predicated upon violence, upon suffering and death. Far from God's Genesis vision of shalom, a balanced and harmonious creation, the only reason you and I are here today is because of millions and billions of years of evolution with species upon species struggling against each other for dominance, superiority, for their very existence. In addition to human tragedies like the story of our friend Herm, the vast expanse of creation itself seems to travel obliviously and mechanically along a murderous path. Sometimes it manifests itself in the depravity of an armed gunman. Sometimes it manifests itself in the publicly sanctioned and systematized torture of animals confined and bred solely for human consumption. What kind of response can Christianity offer to such a worldview? What kind of hope is there? The extreme greatness of Christianity, according to the existentialist philosopher and Christian mystic Simone Weil, lies in the fact that it does not seek a supernatural remedy for suffering, but a supernatural use for it. The extreme greatness of Christianity lies in the fact that it does not seek a supernatural remedy for suffering, but a supernatural use for it. What exactly does that mean? In Luke 24, we find two disciples on a road leading out from Jerusalem to the town of Emmaus. 3 days after Jesus' execution by the Romans, these two disciples are joined on the road by a stranger who, the reader is told, is actually the resurrected Jesus himself. Understandably, the two disciples do not recognize him. As far as they know, Jesus' corpse is already rotting away in the tomb, except there are stories. Some women returned from the tomb that morning claiming that Jesus' body was gone and that they had been met by angels who said that he had been raised from the dead. As they walk along, they're debating the meaning of these recent events until the stranger suddenly interjects, "Oh, how foolish you are, how slow of heart you are to believe that all that the prophets have declared." And then he asks the question, was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Then Luke tells us, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. Now the problem with this, of course, is that the Hebrew Bible contains no such tradition of a suffering Messiah. Nowhere in the Old Testament will you find a passage that explicitly states that the Jewish Messiah will suffer and die. Instead, Jesus changes the story of suffering being told. Instead of suffering and death being signs of God-forsakenness, the suffering and death of Jesus now become the symbol of God incarnate. The meaning of divinity in Jesus' messiahship have been changed, and the scriptures reinterpreted by the lens of the cross. That Christ suffers at the hands of the Romans is God's sign that God suffers along with us and with creation. The cross not only confounds every modern theodicy, it renders them unintelligible. We can no longer speak of the problem of evil as if it's God's problem to fix. It is completely and utterly scandalous. In the ancient world, the cross was not the particularly unique and dramatic way to die that we think of it being today. In fact, it was pretty commonplace. Jesus' death was nothing special. It was a death reserved for slaves and bandits. By the middle of the first century AD, the Roman military commander Titus was responsible for crucifying upwards of 500 Jews in a single day. And yet this Jesus who was crucified has been proclaimed to be God incarnate. In the cross, we see a God who doesn't just suffer and die for us, but suffers and dies with us. But how can God suffer? A God who suffers is no God at all. It's no wonder that in the ancient world, Paul was able to speak of the foolishness of the cross. It remains foolish to this day. But where the rest of the world sees the foolishness of a suffering would-be deity, Paul sees the very wisdom of God overturning the powers that prevail in this world. We proclaim Christ crucified, Paul says, because God chose the gospel of foolishness over wisdom, weakness over power. Now we have to be careful here. I have to be careful here. The cross has been used over the centuries by people who look an awful lot like me to subjugate and oppress those who are different. Women, people of color, sexual minorities, and the economically marginalized. At one time, the symbol of God's triumph against the violence of the state, it has in turn become the state's tool for the oppression of the poor. Now, more than ever, we need to reclaim the cross as the subversive symbol that it is. Feminist theologian Elizabeth Moltmann-Wendell says, where people suffer, Christ suffers with them. If the suffering God has changed the story on what it means to suffer, how does that affect our response to suffering in the world? How does it affect our response to events like the Charleston massacre? How does it affect my understanding of Herman's death alone in a locked storage unit in Israel? How does it change my perception of the billions of animals tortured and slaughtered every year to appease our appetites? We can no longer speak of the suffering of creation as if it is God's problem to fix. So we fix what we can by limiting the suffering that we ourselves cause, by working to end racial and economic oppression and state-sanctioned violence, as we should. I would argue this is the Christian ethical obligation. And in what we cannot fix, we rest, however uneasily, in the truth that God suffers along with us, at least for the time being. Because we know that the Christian hope at the end of suffering and death is the resurrection of the dead and the restoration of the cosmos. Because I believe that every speck of matter in this universe will be redeemed and our suffering along with it. And every wrong will be made right. The God I serve became human to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. In God's own suffering on the cross, God gives us a new story to tell, that everything will be all right, that in the words of Julian of Norwich, all will be well, and all will be well, and every manner of thing will be well, that God will be with us even to the end of the age. And that, my friends, is the gospel. Amen.